All right. Good afternoon. Still no season ticket holder today? All right. Starting off with the announcement of travels by the Secretary General. He will be traveling on the 13th of January to Bogota in Colombia for an official visit to the country to support the peace efforts. On Saturday, his agenda includes meetings with President Juan Manuel Santos Calderón and officials from the government and the armed forces, as well as the leadership of the FARC and the Catholic Church. While in Bogota, the Secretary General will also meet with civil society representatives and with the UN Verification Mission country team working in Colombia. On Sunday, January 14th, the Secretary General will travel to the Department of Meta, where his agenda will include, among other activities, a visit to a territorial area for training and reintegration of former FARC combatants. He will give a press conference at the conclusion of his visit on Sunday evening and will be back at UN headquarters in New York on Monday. If you want more details on the trip, Matthias in my office will be accompanying the Secretary General. Also on Colombia, Jean Arnaud, the special representative of the Secretary General, briefed the Security Council this morning. He told Council members that while the building blocks of stabilization are being put in place, we cannot lose sight of the challenges of the socioeconomic reintegration of some 14,000 former combatants. We must not forget that we are dealing with a large group of former fighters whose level of accumulated frustration with the reintegration process, illustrated by the number of members still in prison, is not easy to overcome. The government, UN agencies, the international community, and civil society will have to be diligent and thorough in our support to their reintegration, while the government of the communities in which they are reinserted, he said. Regarding the process between the government and the ELN, the National Liberation Army, Mr. Arnaud stressed that the clamor for continued suspension of military action has been unanimous and reiterated the need to preserve the reduction of violence that prevailed during the past 3 months, while also advocating for a clear and more reliable ceasefire. And in Tripoli, the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Jeff Feltman, met with Faris Sarraj, the president of the Presidency Council of the Government of National Accord of Libya. He also met with the head of the High Council of State, Mr. Seweli, and the diplomatic corps in Tripoli. As you will see in the note we issued yesterday, he will be in Libya and then in Tunisia until Friday, and we'll have more updates as they come along. And from the Central African Republic, an estimated 58,000 people have been displaced to PAOUA town in northwestern Wampende prefecture. That's according to UNHCR. And that's up from 25,000 people on January 5th, following fighting between the Revolution Justice Movement and the Revolution and Justice and the Movement of National Liberation of Central African Armed Groups. The situation remains precarious, with fighting reported in villages in 5 locations surrounding PAOUA town, which have been looted and burnt. The town itself appears to be calm. Food and the provision of protection in and around the town are top priorities. Some 60 tons of cereal provided by WFP are only sufficient for 10,000 people. The municipality has provided land to humanitarian workers for the establishment of a settlement site, but the capacity of the site is far lower than the expected influx of people. Meanwhile, insecurity on the roads surrounding PAOUA is impeding access to people in need of assistance. A mission led by the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs will deploy there tomorrow to further assess the situation and reinforce local efforts. Turning to Syria, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, today condemned the upsurge in civilian casualties in eastern Ghouta amid the recent escalation in airstrikes and ground-based attacks by government forces and their allies. He said that all parties are obliged under international law to distinguish between lawful military targets and civilians and civilian infrastructure. Meanwhile, we welcome the exceptional delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance to an estimated 50,000 Syrian men, women, and children stranded at Rukban near Jordan's northeastern border with Syria earlier this week. The delivery of humanitarian assistance from Jordan began on January 8th and so far has provided assistance to over 18,000 people. The operation will continue until all 50,000 people have been reached. The humanitarian aid includes food, specialized winterization kits, and other forms of assistance. And turning to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the World Health Organization warns that heavy rains and flooding may exacerbate the country's ongoing cholera epidemic, the most severe over 20 years. The current outbreak, which began last July, is one of the most severe in years. Health experts fear that the situation in Kinshasa might still considerably worsen due to a combination of overcrowding and ongoing rainy season. WHO reports that 24 out of 26 provinces have been infected with the disease. The latest reports find 55,000 cases, including over 1,200 deaths for 2017 alone, double the number of cases from last year. Cholera response is ongoing in Kasai and other provinces, but they've been affected by severe cuts in humanitarian funding, diminished response capacities, and a breakdown of pipelines and medical supplies at the local level. And today in Nairobi, our colleagues from the UN Environment Programme and the World Health Organization announced a collaboration to curb environmental health risks that cause an estimated 12.6 million deaths a year. Two agencies agreed to collaborate on the initiatives to combat air pollution, climate change, and antimicrobial resistance, as well as improve coordination on waste and chemical management, water quality, and food and nutrition issues. More information online. Lastly, you will have seen, and almost lastly, you will have seen that we issued a statement yesterday late afternoon welcoming the progress during the high-level inter-Korean talks that took place on January 9th, particularly the agreement to work ease military tensions and hold military-to-military talks and reopen the inter-Korean military hotline. The Secretary General also seized the opportunity to acknowledge other efforts that have contributed to reducing tensions, and he hopes such engagement and efforts will contribute to the resumption of sincere dialogue leading to sustainable peace and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. And lastly, I was asked earlier by one of your colleagues for reaction on the killing of an Israeli rabbi yesterday, and I can say the following. That our position on violence and incitement and terrorism is well known. There is no justification for terror, nor for those who condone it, praise it, or glorify it. Such heinous acts only perpetuate the circle of violence, hindering efforts to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The perpetrators of yesterday's attacks must be brought to justice. That's it. Rodrigo.
Thank you, Steph. Prosecutors are seeking charges against two journalists from Reuters in Myanmar. Does the Secretary General have a comment on this new development?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, the Secretary General expressed his concern at the situation when he was first asked about it. I know our colleagues in the UN country team are following the case very closely of the two Reuters journalists. I think the Secretary General has repeated and will continue to repeat his concern at the erosion of press freedom in Myanmar and calling on the international community to do everything to secure the journalists' release and freedom of the press in Myanmar. Madame.
Stephane, did the UN Special Coordinator for Middle East Peace Process, Mr. Mladenov, issue any statement since the declaration of Mr. Trump, President Trump, of moving the embassy to Jerusalem and the killing of 15 Palestinians, most of them, or a lot of them, youth and children? Thank you.
I think the Secretary General in his own statement was very clear on his reaction to the decision announced by the United States, reiterating his call to halt any unilateral actions that would undermine the two-state solution, reiterating the fact that Jerusalem should be considered as a final status issue to be negotiated by the parties. I think Mr. Mladenov has expressed his concern at the number of civilian deaths that we've seen.
But a follow-up, but he didn't issue any statement regarding the killing of Palestinians, where at the moment where casualties on the other side, like yesterday, the killing of the rabbi in the settlement, he immediately issued a statement. So the question is, why doesn't he issue any statements when Palestinians are killed, where he does do this when Israelis are killed?
I think whether it's the special coordinator or the UN system, I would refer you back to the monthly briefings, and I think we've been very clear in condemning and expressing a sorrow of the loss of lives of civilians on all sides. Yep.
Is there any sympathy or agreement with President Moon's assertion yesterday that it was the U.S. strategy of max pressure through sanctions that sort of brought the Koreans together to talk?
Well, I think it's not for me to comment on what President Moon said. I think the Secretary General, his own statement, noted the contribution of other factors to what has led to those discussions. I think I would also remind you of the very important trip that Undersecretary Jeff Feltman took to North Korea not too long ago, bringing messages from the Secretary General and encouraging dialogue, and we very much think that also played a part. Yep. Hold on, Elman, go ahead.
Is there any update on the UN action on to end the slavery in Libya?
Our colleagues at UNHCR and the organization of the International Organization of Migration are working on the ground in places where they can access to help find and to help bring back, repatriate voluntarily migrants from various sub-Saharan African countries so they can go home in safety. And obviously we would want to see those criminal elements who are participating in this heinous trade brought to justice.
Is there any time frame that we can expect?
Right, it's an ongoing. It's an ongoing operation. I think the fact that we have to see in the 21st century these types of images and this type of treatment of human beings by other human beings, I think only underscores the need for the international community to come together and agree on a global migration plan. As you know, the Secretary General will address this in the next few days when his report comes out, and the need to take away the power of the smugglers and the human traffickers and establish legal pathways and establish protections for humans who are moving and seeking a better life while recognizing their rights and their dignity. Rodrigo, and then Evelyn.
Thanks. You mentioned on the Secretary General's visit to Colombia, different people he was going to meet. Is there any plan on maybe reaching out to anything related to the ELN while he's there?
I have no doubt that discussions concerning the ELN will come up in discussions. As you know, there have been the government there were discussions going on in Ecuador between the ELN and the government. I think we're concerned by the incident that we saw this morning, an attack on an oil pipeline. We're obviously following those developments very closely, and we're also keeping the Security Council informed. Evelyn, then we'll go back.
They would like to have some kind of, speaking of Ecuador, the government would like to have some kind of an agreement to get Julian Assange out of its embassy. And in the BBC wrap-up of this, they mentioned that a UN committee, a UN panel, which is probably a committee, in 2016 said the man should go free. Do you know which?
It was, if I'm not mistaken, it's a subsidiary organ of the Human Rights Council, and I think it was a committee on arbitrary detention.
In Geneva,
effect,
or
right,
here, yeah.
Which operates independently.
Yeah, because that's a pretty stupid statement.
That's what I will let you do the analysis.
Right.
Madame.
Any updates on Yemen and the blockade and the humanitarian efforts?
No, no good news. Obviously, I mean, some humanitarian aid is going in, but overall, the suffering of the Yemeni people continues unabated.
Where is Mr. Waldi Sheikh Ahmed?
He is, if I recall, he's in Amman and continuing his, where he's based, and continuing his contacts.
But, I mean, a follow-up, but which efforts are you, I mean, I know that you have been trying to talk with the Saudi-led coalition regarding lifting the blockade. Are you still in contact, and which answers are you getting now? Why it's not?
We,
I mean,
we
have been
continue
talking
to be
about
in
this since
constant
2 months.
contact with the coalition to ensure a greater flow of humanitarian aid, but there remains obstacles. The biggest obstacle, obviously, being the continued fighting. Yes.
On North Korea at the Winter Olympics, the US and the Olympic Committee have both said we need to make sure that the UN sanctions aren't violated by the participation. Can you give any kind of indication of what sanctions could be
Well, as you
relevant?
know, there are sanctions put in place by the Security Council, including sanctions having to do with the transfer of money and all sorts of financial things. So whatever it is incumbent for member states to respect those sanctions and obviously work with the relevant Security Council Sanctions Committee to ensure that the sanctions are not violated or that derogations may be granted, but things need to be done in accordance, obviously, with international law.
So does the SG anticipate that it could kind of put a spanner in the works?
You know, we
any
try not to be
delegation?
in the business of anticipating. Well, we're in the business of being prepared. We don't want to predict. What is, I think, the fact that the DPRK will be sending a delegation to the Winter Olympics is a positive movement. That can only be welcomed. And we expect that all the details of that visit will be worked out within the relevant international law and the sanctions, which is dealt with directly by the Security Council and the Sanctions Committee. Yes, sir.
Will the special envoy to Syria be attending the Sochi talks?
A decision has not yet been made. Decision will be made in due time, but I think we very much welcome the statements that we've seen from the Russian representative here that all of this is being done in. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but in terms of in coordination and in preparation for Geneva and not in competition with the Geneva process. Okay, thank you very much.